What truly drives a young man to march willingly into the unknown horrors of industrial-scale warfare? In 1914, the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand in Sarajevo ignited a complex fuse, causing the tangled web of European alliances to detonate. One by one, the great powers were dragged into a conflict that promised to reshape the continent and end civilization as they knew it. By late 1916, Europe was locked in a brutal stalemate, and the war was far from over. This was not the quick, decisive war everyone had promised, a dark test of the human spirit. But as the conflict dragged on, who were the men holding the line? Meet Albert Birdie Fletcher of Liverpool, a veteran who has endured 2 years in the soul-crushing trenches. At the age of 21, this former shop clerk is a battle-hardened soldier, bearing both the physical and mental scars of the most relentless conditions ever witnessed in combat. Yet, the memory of his past as a 19-year-old shopkeeper prior to the declaration of war seems a distant dream. When Lord Kitchener issued the famous call for volunteers, a call echoing across Britain, Birdie felt an overwhelming eagerness to serve. Why? Because the war was sold as an adventure, a chance to see the world and be a hero, over by Christmas. He briefly considered joining the Royal Navy, but the thought of confinement on a small ship, a tin can bobbing in the ocean, did not appeal to him. Instead, he joined the immense flood of young men enlisting in the army, signing away his civilian life for king and country. Historically, a regular army commitment was for 12 years, but in light of the new hostilities, a shorter term was enacted to rapidly fill the ranks. After a lengthy wait in a winding queue, Fletcher signed up for 3 years, or the duration of the war, whichever term proved longer. Little did he know how ominous that condition would prove to be. But before picking up a rifle, he had to pass a gauntlet of tests. Regulations required a recruit to be between 18 and 38 years old and at least 5 feet 3 inches tall. Birdie, at 19 and 5 feet 9 inches, effortlessly met these physical criteria. He then proceeded to a thorough medical examination, doctors scrutinizing his vision, hearing, heart, and lungs, checking for any sign of disease, assessing his teeth and speech, and measuring against numerous other exacting criteria. He passed every test. The Army had its man. However, in the chaotic early days of the war, recruitment offices and medical staff were often overwhelmed. The demand for men was so desperate that records show many who did not meet the standards. Men with poor eyesight, missing teeth, or old injuries were approved for military service anyway. Once the medical was complete, Fletcher stood before his superiors and swore an oath of loyalty to king and country upon a Bible, vowing to obey his officers and serve until the end of hostilities. The massive influx of recruits necessitated the creation of new battalions, which were then attached to existing regiments. Fletcher was assigned to the King's Liverpool Regiment, a unit whose history stretched back to the 17th century. This history, this sense of lineage, was meant to instill pride and courage. He was plunged into rigorous training, often in makeshift camps, where he quickly learned the core tenets of soldiering. Discipline was strict, unforgiving, designed to break the civilian out and beat the soldier in. This process, however brutal, forged him and his comrades into a cohesive unit that could obey orders instinctively and fight in what was rapidly becoming a war on an industrial scale. This intensive process transformed civilians like Birdie into the soldiers soon to be dispatched to the front. But as Fletcher prepared to face the horrors of the Western Front, far from the mud and gunfire, others were determining the fate of nations. Generals and political leaders were shaping the very course of the war, deciding where men would be sent and which countries would rise or fall. What tactical blunder or stroke of genius was about to be unleashed that would fundamentally alter the outcome of this devastating war? The decisions being made in distant offices would soon determine if Birdie lived or died. One of the most vital skills Fletcher mastered was the use of his weapon, the short-magazine Lee-Enfield Mark III, or SMLE. Adopted by the British Army in 1907, this reliable rifle was the true workhorse of the infantry. As the chaos of movement settled into the stalemate of the trenches, the soldiers created an extensive network that stretched over 400 miles, from the Belgian coast to the border of Switzerland. The German strategy was more defensive, designed for the long run, digging deep, concrete-reinforced bunkers. In contrast, the Entente forces, the British and French, still clung to the desperate, costly hope that one more massive offensive, one more charge across no man's land, would secure victory. As a result, the British trenches were often miserable makeshift affairs with poor drainage that left them perpetually muddy, and reliant on slippery wooden duckboards to keep soldiers from sinking into the muck. Rats were a constant plague, feeding on the remnants of food and the unburied. The air was thick with the inescapable stench of decay, creosote, and stale cigarette smoke. The smell of survival. The trenches were arranged in multiple layers: the firing trench at the front, the support trench behind it, and finally, a reserve trench farther back. All were connected by a series of communication trenches, allowing for movement without exposure to enemy fire. Soldiers did not remain in one position indefinitely, instead rotating through the firing line, support, and reserve positions, ideally spending 4 days to a week in each. This rotation was vital to prevent men from succumbing entirely to the psychological strain of the front line. But on the Western Front, circumstances were rarely ideal. Sometimes, a critical position meant weeks on the firing line with no rest. It is now late 1916, and Fletcher is huddled in his frontline firing trench, closest to the enemy. He adjusts the 1908 pattern webbing worn over his uniform, which holds his 17-inch bayonet, canteen, ammunition pouches, and his entrenching tool, which could serve as a brutal weapon in close-quarters combat. Around his legs are puttees, strips of cloth meant to keep out the constant moisture and mud, a defense against the dreaded trench foot, a painful, debilitating condition. A pair of dry socks, he knows, is as vital as a functioning rifle. On his head sits the distinctive steel Birdie helmet first issued in 1915, after it became clear that cloth caps offered no protection from shrapnel. And within easy reach is his gas mask, a grim necessity against the potential use of mustard or chlorine gas. Life in the trenches followed a defined, wearying routine, a constant battle against the element of surprise. Each morning, everyone in the line would stand to before dawn, stepping up to the firing line, rifle ready, prepared to repel any attack the enemy might launch under the cover of the first light. Once the threat subsided, sentries were posted, and the remaining men turned to other tasks. After a meager breakfast of tinned meat, he's told it's beef, but he has his doubts, his non-commissioned officer, NCO, inspects his weapon and kit. He then helps with the unending labor of reinforcing the trench walls and replacing the slippery wooden duckboards, which are perpetually in need of repair after the recent rains. Then comes a soldier's most constant companion, boredom. When not on alert or engaged in manual labor, there is little to do. Fletcher seizes the opportunity to write a letter to his parents in Liverpool, one of the 12 million pieces of mail sent home weekly, the lifeline connecting the front to the world it was fighting for. After a midday meal, he takes up a post in one of the small dugouts slightly ahead of the main line, a sentry constantly vigilant against assault, infiltration, or the nightmare of a gas attack. On this day, he and his comrades are fortunate. The enemy, mere hundreds of yards away, is not in the mood for a fight. The day passes in a quiet, tense lull, the only significant movement a very large rat scuttling past his boot. But quiet days are a rare luxury. Just a few months prior, Fletcher and elements of the King's Regiment were embroiled in the horrific Battle of the Somme. Weeks of mass assaults against German positions under a hail of machine gun fire and incessant artillery led to the loss of tens of thousands of British soldiers on the first day alone, the single greatest loss of life in the nation's military history. Fletcher was one of the fortunate few, sustaining a superficial shrapnel wound to his shoulder and arm. He was bandaged at an aid station but immediately sent back to the front. The phantom echoes of enemy machine gun fire still reverberate in his mind as he snaps back to the present. How did the command justify this repeated, devastating loss of life for mere yards of conquered territory? The day is almost done. At dusk, the men stand to once more, a defense against infiltration as the night closes in. Sleep is not a guaranteed comfort in the trenches. Sentries are posted again, and some, like Fletcher, are sent out into no man's land to repair and restring the barbed wire stretching in front of the line. A dangerous necessity that demands leaving the relative safety of the trenches under the cover of darkness. Every trip is a gamble with death. With yet another year just around the corner, the future remains desperately uncertain. France has been bled white, their army suffering crippling casualties. The Russians are teetering on the edge of collapse, their own internal revolution brewing. And while there are persistent rumors of the Americans finally getting involved, few seriously believe such an isolationist nation will commit to the fight, crossing an entire ocean to intervene in a European quarrel. But what if they did? How would the arrival of a fresh, limitless supply of men and resources change the face of the war? Fletcher settles in for a restless sleep, his promise ringing in his ears: 3 years or the duration, whichever was longer. The way the Great War was going, he knew in his heart it would be a very, very long time indeed. The story of World War I is one of ordinary men facing extraordinary challenges, battling not only the enemy, but the very elements, the boredom, and the profound trauma of the industrial age. We hope this animated historical document has given you a glimpse into the unforgiving reality of the trenches. This is history brought to life, meticulously researched and based on the work of respected historians whose references are shown on screen. Don't miss our upcoming videos as we continue to explore the pivotal moments of our past. Please like, comment, share, and subscribe to our channel to join our community and support our mission to make history captivating and unforgettable.